In the cool silence of an early October morning in 2001, the world stood on edge. Across the globe, television screens glowed with breaking news tickers and the same haunting images. The ruins of New York's Twin Towers, smoke still rising, faces of shock and disbelief frozen in time. America was wounded. The world was shaken, and behind the chaos a storm was building. The United States, backed by allies, was about to launch the longest war in its history. The mission had a name that carried both resolve and warning: Operation Enduring Freedom. The skies over Afghanistan were quiet on October 7, 2001, but not for long. Somewhere in the darkness, the engines of B-1 bombers rumbled to life. Cruise missiles locked onto coordinates. Thousands of miles away, analysts and commanders watched digital maps as glowing dots tracked across enemy territory. At 9:30 p.m. local time, the first wave struck. Explosions lit the horizon around Kandahar and Kabul. Communication towers, military camps, and Taliban strongholds disappeared into fire. The world's most powerful military had begun its war against terror. To understand this operation, we must step back to that defining moment in September 2001. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon weren't just acts of terror. They were declarations of war from an invisible enemy. Behind them was al-Qaeda, a global terrorist network led by Osama bin Laden, operating from sanctuaries inside Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban regime. The U.S. demanded justice, surrender bin Laden, and dismantle terrorist bases. The Taliban refused. That refusal set the stage for what came next. Within days, the Pentagon's planners devised a strategy that would combine precision air power with unconventional warfare. But this wasn't going to be a traditional invasion. Afghanistan's terrain was unforgiving: rugged mountains, deep valleys, and deserts where empires had fallen before. So the U.S. needed partners on the ground. Enter the Northern Alliance, a coalition of Afghan factions already fighting the Taliban. Together they formed the spearhead of the campaign. As U.S. aircraft roared overhead, small teams of elite soldiers, CIA operatives, and U.S. Special Forces infiltrated Afghanistan on horseback and foot, linking up with local fighters. Their mission: call in airstrikes, provide intelligence, and pave the way for the fall of Taliban power. It was warfare that mixed ancient tactics with modern technology: laser-guided bombs controlled by men riding through dust storms on Afghan horses. By November 2001, the Taliban lines began to crumble. The combination of relentless bombing and coordinated assaults broke their defenses. Cities fell one by one: Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, Kabul. Each victory came faster than analysts had predicted. In just weeks, the Taliban, who had ruled most of Afghanistan for years, were in retreat. On December 7th, Kandahar, their spiritual stronghold, fell. The regime had collapsed. America and its allies seemed victorious. But beneath the surface of triumph, something dangerous was brewing. Osama bin Laden and key al-Qaeda leaders had escaped into the mountains of Tora Bora, near the Pakistan border. There, in a labyrinth of caves and tunnels, they fought back against U.S. and Afghan forces. Airstrikes thundered for days, echoing through the peaks. Special operations troops hunted them relentlessly. Yet in the chaos, bin Laden slipped away, vanishing into the tribal frontier. That escape would haunt the mission for years to come. As 2002 began, Operation Enduring Freedom evolved. The initial invasion had succeeded, but the real challenge was just beginning: nation-building and counterinsurgency. Afghanistan was a land fractured by decades of war. Warlords controlled regions. Infrastructure was shattered and millions were displaced. The U.S. and its allies shifted their focus: rebuild, stabilize, and prevent Afghanistan from ever again becoming a terrorist haven. NATO joined the effort through the International Security Assistance Force, ISF. Roads were rebuilt, schools reopened, and democratic elections were organized. The Afghan people voted for a new government under Hamid Karzai, marking a new chapter of hope. But while the world watched Kabul rise from the ruins, far beyond the cities, the Taliban began to regroup. In the mountains and remote valleys, former fighters returned. They adapted, learned, and waited. From Pakistan's border regions, they launched ambushes and bombings. IEDs, improvised explosive devices, became their weapon of choice, silent killers buried under dusty roads. Every patrol could be the last. For the soldiers on the ground, Afghanistan became a war of patience and vigilance. Operation Enduring Freedom was no longer a short campaign. It had become a grinding test of endurance. Coalition troops from more than 40 nations deployed to Afghanistan. American Marines fought through Helmand's poppy fields. British and Canadian forces held strongpoints in Kandahar. German, Polish, and Australian troops took on security and reconstruction missions. The war was no longer about one man. It was about preventing an ideology from taking root again. By 2005, the situation had become more complex. The Taliban, once defeated, had returned with a vengeance. Their tactics evolved: hit-and-run attacks, suicide bombings, and assassinations. Villages that once welcomed coalition forces now lived in fear. The line between friend and foe blurred. US and NATO troops had to adapt. They shifted from large-scale battles to counterinsurgency, a fight not just for land, but for hearts and minds. Every soldier had to become more than a fighter. They became teachers, builders, and protectors. Schools were built, clinics opened, wells dug. Soldiers patrolled by day and helped villagers by night. Each interaction was a battle for trust. But the Taliban's shadow was never far. Every act of progress faced sabotage. Every step forward risked being erased by a single explosion. Then came the mountain battles, the legendary operations that defined endurance. Operation Anaconda in 2002 was one of them. High in the Shai-Kot Valley, US forces faced one of the fiercest engagements of the war. What was expected to be a short fight turned into a week-long siege. Soldiers fought from ridgelines and caves, under sniper fire and freezing winds. It was there that men became legends, holding their ground against overwhelming odds. Years passed. Presidents changed, strategies shifted, but the mission remained the same: deny terrorists a sanctuary. As 2008 arrived, violence surged once again. The Taliban's influence expanded, and casualties mounted. Drones began to play a larger role, unmanned aircraft that hunted militants with precision from the skies. Their silent presence changed the face of modern warfare. By 2009, under President Barack Obama, a surge of US troops was ordered. Tens of thousands more soldiers deployed to regain control of Taliban-heavy regions. The strategy: clear, hold, and build. Town by town, valley by valley, coalition forces fought to stabilize Afghanistan. The cost was high: lives lost, injuries endured, and billions spent. But for a moment it seemed to be working. Markets reopened, schools filled with children, and a fragile peace took hold. Yet peace in Afghanistan was always temporary, fragile like glass. The Taliban adapted again, fading into villages by day, striking by night. The war stretched into its second decade. The faces of young soldiers changed, but the mountains and the mission stayed the same. Generations rotated through the same dusty outposts, chasing the same ghosts across the same hills. Then came a breakthrough that shifted the entire narrative. In May 2011, nearly 10 years after the attacks that started it all, US Navy SEALs launched Operation Neptune Spear, the mission that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Though not part of Operation Enduring Freedom's direct battlefield, it was its symbolic victory. The man who had sparked the war was gone. For many, it was justice. For others, it was a reminder of how far the war had taken them from that first October night. After bin Laden's death, attention turned to winding down the war. NATO began transferring security responsibilities to Afghan forces. Training programs intensified. The goal: an Afghan army capable of defending its own country. One by one, international troops prepared to withdraw, but the fight was far from over. Insurgent attacks continued. Corruption and instability plagued the young Afghan government. The dream of peace seemed always just out of reach. By 2014, after 13 long years, the US officially ended Operation Enduring Freedom. On December 28th, in a quiet ceremony in Kabul, the mission's flag was folded for the last time. The operation that had begun in vengeance ended in uncertainty. A new mission replaced it: Operation Freedom Sentinel, marking a shift from combat to support and counterterrorism. But for those who served, the name didn't matter. The memories remained carved into their souls. Over 2,300 American service members had lost their lives. Tens of thousands more were wounded. Afghan civilians, men, women, and children, paid a heavier price still. Entire generations grew up under the echo of helicopters and the distant sound of gunfire. Yet amid the loss there were moments of hope. Schools filled with girls for the first time in decades, hospitals built, roads repaired, elections held. Small victories that often went unnoticed, but meant everything to those who lived them. Operation Enduring Freedom wasn't just a military campaign, it was a human story. It was about resilience in a land scarred by history, about soldiers who left home not knowing if they'd return, about Afghan families who dared to believe in a future despite the odds. It was about the limits of power and the endurance of will. As the years passed and new conflicts emerged elsewhere, Afghanistan faded from the headlines. But for those who were there, for the pilots who flew through mountain storms, for the medics who saved lives in dusty tents, for the children who watched foreign soldiers build schools in their villages, the legacy of Operation Enduring Freedom lives on. It was not a clean victory nor a simple defeat. It was something far more complicated, a test of resolve that revealed both the strength and the fragility of nations. And as history will remember, the operation's true measure was not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the endurance of those who carried its burden. Because in the end, freedom, like endurance, is not given. It is fought for, suffered for, and sometimes only partially won. The final chapter of Operation Enduring Freedom closed with the same tone it began, with a question echoing across time. Was the world safer or simply changed? The answer depends on where you stand. For some, it was justice served. For others, a reminder of the cost of vengeance. But one thing is certain. In the harsh mountains and deserts of Afghanistan, the world learned once again that freedom has a price, and endurance demands everything. In the fading light of that long war, as soldiers boarded their final flights home, the engines roared like they had in 2001. But this time the mission was not to destroy, but to depart, with hope that the seeds planted through years of sacrifice might one day grow into peace. Whether they will or not, history is still deciding, and as the last aircraft lifted into the sky, leaving the Afghan dust swirling below, a voice in the darkness whispered what the world had known all along. Enduring freedom is never free.